Okay, friends, good evening again, and welcome to session 5 of the Dark Night, and we are going to begin with scripture. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. A reading from the Gospel according to John. I'm beginning this story about halfway through the story of the Samaritan woman. And so, the woman said to Jesus, "Sir, I can see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you people say that the place to worship is in Jerusalem." Jesus said to her, "Believe me, woman, the hour is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You people worship what you do not understand. We worship what we understand because salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming and is now here when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. And indeed, the Father seeks such people to worship Him. God is spirit, and those who worship Him must worship in spirit and truth." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. I will make a reference to this passage somewhere during the course of our talk this evening. So I'm going to begin with where I left off last week, and specifically, you remember we said of the signs of the night of the purgation of senses, and I said there were 3 signs, and we dealt with the first one. The second one, I feel I rushed through it, and I want to explain that a little bit more. And it's not in the notes today, but it's in your notes from last week. And then I want to deal with the third sign, and then go on to talk about how do we conduct ourselves during this night of purgation or the dark night. How do those who are going through the dark night conduct themselves? What do we do? What shall we not do when you're going through the night? So, but before we do that, can I just give a brief summary of where we are, okay? So I think what John of the Cross begins with in his entire journey is that some people have a stirring in the heart, which itself is a gift from God, and they recognize that, and they try to respond to that. And part of the response that we make is to understand that both the body and the soul have appetites, and I need to pay attention to the soul and its ultimate desire and goal, which is to be in total union with God, divine love. As you begin this journey, you realize that there is the need for purification or purgation. And there are 2 kinds of purgations or purifications: active and passive. Active is what the human person does, understanding that there is a divine movement in the soul, and you respond to that, and you begin then to focus more and more on the needs of the soul. And one of the ways you do that is to purify the sensory part of the soul. Now, as you do that, what do you expect? You expect tremendous amount of sweetness, what John of the Cross would say. Sensory feelings, which sometimes you might get attached to. And so spirituality often becomes where I am doing things so that I may have the sweetness in me. But those who follow this path of purgation in the way that God leads will suddenly realize that sometimes instead of God becoming closer, you feel that God is actually drawing further away, which is farthest from the truth. But the point is that God is leading the soul to a higher place. It is as it were, God hides a little bit. Why? Because God wants you to spiritually grow. So you have the analogy of the mother who does not always breastfeed the child and slowly begins to make the child, to wean the child away from that which the child is attached to, so that the child may indeed grow. And that's the same analogy with God, that God hides not because God is abandoning you, but God hides because God is trying to wean you away from the sensory sweetness to take you to a higher level of spiritual growth, which is contemplation. And at this stage, it's not we who are the actors, but God is the actor within us. So this moving away from the sensory sweetness to this lack of sensory sweetness and relying on God now completely, without any desire, which is what the ascent to Mount Carmel is all about. This is the preparation for contemplation, and really contemplation is then what God does within the human person. So in one sense, I think that's the summary of what we've done thus far. Last week, we tried to describe what the dark night feels like, but then we also described what are the signs of the dark night. And I said, let me very briefly, the first sign is that, in other words, is the dark night, or is something else going on? That's what the question was. And he says there are three signs when you know that the dark night is indeed the dark night. The first sign is that you do not find comfort in things of God, but then you also don't find comfort in created things. So if you were becoming disengaged with the spiritual things, but you were still very into the temporal things, then there's an imbalance. Something is wrong. So he's saying that the sign of the dark night is that the soul of the human person finds distaste sometimes, or finds no comfort in spiritual things, but at the same time does not find comfort in worldly things. But this is God bringing the soul into the dark night to wean it from the sweetness and allowing the soul not to be attached to desires, but waiting for God to do what God can do. The second sign, and here is where I want to spend a little time today, because I feel I touched on it, and my eyes were on the clock, and I realized that I probably did not have too much time, so I did not explain this very well, but I'm going to do that now and then go to the third sign and then go to how to conduct ourselves during this. The second sign is that while the soul does not find comfort in spiritual things, there is a painful anxiety and a carefulness that the soul is not serving God. In other words, I'm not feeling anything. I am truly focused upon God, but that sweetness that existed prior to the dark night, I'm not feeling anything. But then it's not like you are content. There is a painful anxiety that the soul is not serving God, and perhaps it's going backwards. So in this case, this painful anxiety is the test. Why? What's going on? It's like, I'll give you a very simple example of what painful anxiety is. Sometimes I try to call my mother, and there are 3 ways she has 3 phones, there are 3 ways I can call my mother, right? There is the WhatsApp, I can talk to her, she doesn't pick up. There's the cell phone, and she doesn't pick up. And then there's the landline, and she won't pick up. And I do this about 10 times, and my anxiety is she lying on the bathroom floor somewhere? What is going on? Or I'm supposed to call my mother at 10:30 every night and 7:30 every morning. I talk to her twice a day. And sometimes I fall asleep in the night and it's 10:30 and I'm gone, and I realize I haven't called. That whole day is painful anxiety for her. She thinks I'm dead. But you see, it's not that there is no love, there is no interest. It's just that there's no connection at the moment. I'm not feeling anything, but there is this painful anxiety about I'm falling back on what God is trying to do. So this is not weakness. This is not lukewarmness. To separate lukewarmness towards God, or that I'm not doing something right, that's what's going on over here, because the dark night is the first night time you're going through this. We don't know how to describe it, right? Each person. So how do I know that, am I just being lukewarm, or is it actually the dark night? So to know that it's the dark night, you are not feeling anything. There is no sweetness. At the same time, there is this painful anxiety about not being there. So the true purgative aridity, or the dryness that comes from the purification, is accompanied by a painful anxiety because the soul thinks it is not serving God, even though it is. There is another little difference there. Even though in the sensual part of the soul, in the sensory part of the soul, you don't feel any connection, there is somehow in the spirit a certain strength that you can feel. In other words, you're not completely depleted of, I'm not feeling anything, that sweetness, I feel I'm not serving God, but the spirit is not as weak as the sensual part, the sensory part. I should use the word sensory instead of sensual part. So you still feel in the spirit a certain strength. So that's another sign that it's not just lukewarmness or it's just a weakness. It is actually a sign of the dark night. The spirit even feels strong, even though you don't sensorily feel the closeness to God. The spirit is not left hopeless, feels strong. Now, the other thing to understand about this second sign is the reason for this dryness. Why do I feel this dryness? Why am I feeling this lack of sweetness? And John of the Cross explains it this way. He said, God is transferring. Remember, everything that we felt thus far, we were feeling in the sensory part of the soul, right? The sweetness that you feel, you're feeling in the sensory part of the soul. There is a spiritual part of the soul. We haven't gone to that dark night of the spirit. So God is transferring to the spiritual, or to the spirit, those things that thus far gave sweetness to the senses. We have to understand what John of the Cross explains as the reason for the dryness. There is this transitionary phase. So what you were feeling thus far in the sensory part of the soul, the sweetness, is now being transferred to the spiritual. The spirit, having tasted a little bit of the strength, the hope that it feels, and the spirit is now receiving its proper nourishment. Remember the word appetite? The spirit is now receiving the appetite. That which is going to fulfill its appetite. The sensory part feels weak. So what was thus the sensory part of the soul is being transferred here. The soul is beginning to feel fed, but the sensory part begins to feel that something is missing. And the spirit becomes strong, more vigilant, and careful than before, so that there is no negligence in serving God. And what I mean by that is, even though the person is not feeling this sensory satisfaction, sweetness, the spirit is still bent on serving God, making sure that it stays on track. In other words, it doesn't say, oh, this is all a waste of time, I'm done, and just back to fulfilling the appetites of the body, right? So the spirit does not allow the person to do that. That's why it's strong. It kind of gives the spirit that sense of, be careful. You're still on the right track, even though I'm not feeling the sweetness. So at first, there is no consciousness of the spiritual sweetness and delight. In this timeless transfer from the sensory part to the spiritual part, there is no consciousness of the spiritual sweetness and delight. But dryness and aridity and distaste, because this is a novelty, this is a change. I'm not used to this. So I was, again, back to my mother and about examples. She just recently had a pacemaker put on her, right? She's just getting used to it. She doesn't feel like she felt before. She doesn't feel like she should really feel. She's in this transitionary phase where she doesn't feel the old or the new. But the new, there is a time when the pacemaker is adjusted and the person gets used to it, and then they will feel what they are. So it's something, it's a novelty, it's a new way where your heart beats, right? So the palate, our sensory palate, is accustomed to the sensible and looks for it still, but it's not there. Why? Because God is transferring it to the spirit, and the spirit is not yet used to what it is now being fed. And because the spiritual palate is not prepared and purified for so delicious a taste, it takes time for the soul to be disposed for it in the arid and dark night. It's going to take the time for the soul to get disposed to this new reality. It cannot taste the spiritual food yet, but it can only taste the dryness and the aridity because it does not taste the sweetness it was tasting before. The contemplation is in general, so this contemplation, this phase, this contemplation where you are in this transitionary phase, John of the Cross says, is in general secret and unknown to the person who is admitted into it. And with the aridity and emptiness which it produces in the senses, it makes the soul long for solitude and quiet. This is one of those very, very important phases in this journey. The spirit is strong. You can feel it. I'm not feeling the sweetness, but I feel strength in my spirit. I still don't understand. I still don't know. God is still not at this point where God is giving the soul, that presence that the soul is seeking for. But it makes the soul long for solitude and quiet. If they who knew this state knew how to be quiet and resign themselves into the hands of God with a loving interior obedience to God's voice, they would have in this tranquility a most delicious sense of this interior food, which is now we're getting into the point of contemplation. Right. I live alone, and it's a wonderful feeling. You may not agree. But generally, from the time I get up till I go back to bed, there's nothing playing in my room. Sometimes in the morning, I'll put some classical music on. Not because I appreciate classical music, but it's at least better than other noise that I can hear. And there is a holiness. There is a sense of awe in this quiet and solitude that the soul seeks. It's one thing for you to want to be quiet physically. But then what John of the Cross is saying is that in this time of contemplation where you are not all there yet, I don't feel the sweetness, but the spiritual part of the soul is strong. The soul just wants. Why? Because it wants that appetite to be filled, to be fulfilled. And the thing is, I can't do anything to fulfill it. It's completely reliant on God. So it longs for that solitude and quiet. And if people knew how to be quiet, that's one thing. But then also, leave yourselves in God's hands. Don't be anxious about when is it going to happen, what is going to happen, how. Just, again, remember, nada, no desire at all. With a loving interior obedience to God's voice, they would have in this tranquility, John of the Cross says, a most delicious sense of interior food. This food is so delicate that in general it eludes our perceptions in the beginning. And it's happened because you have not tasted it yet. And what you do is, if we make any special effort to feel it, then it's like the air which vanishes when we try to grasp it. And this is that loving obedience that you have. So you maybe get one taste of that contemplation, that presence, that union that God gives. And if you try to grasp it, it's like going for the air, that you grasp it and it's gone. So this is the second sign that you're entering into, and the reasons why John of the Cross says that it happens. Third sign. The third sign is the inability to meditate and make reflections and to excite the imagination. So where is the imagination? It's the mind. Where does contemplation happen? In the soul. So the third sign of this dark night is that you are unable to meditate and to make reflections and to excite the imagination. Because why? Because God is now communicating no more in those faculties. God is not communicating anymore. God is communicating elsewhere. God is communicating in pure spirit. And that's why I read the gospel passage that I read. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. God leads these persons into this night, the dark night, only to try and humble them and to correct their desires. Not for the purpose of leading them okay, let me read that again. To humble them and to correct their desires, that they may not grow up to be spiritual gluttons, constantly waiting for that sensory sweetness that you get, because you are the one who's doing that, right? not for the purpose of leading them into the way of the Spirit, which is contemplation. Now, John of the Cross here says something that was not easy for me to hear, because you do all this work, and then he says, God does not lead everyone to perfect contemplation, and only God knows why. So darn it, I've done all this work, and God says, for some reason, you're not it? Well, at least I have done something. What have I done? I have purified my life. I am fulfilling the appetite of the soul. Those things are still better than where I am now. Even if I don't get to the point of that perfect contemplation or the state of perfection in this earth, at least I've prepared myself when I pass away from this earth to be in perfect union with God. So it's not a waste of time. So but different gifts, different spirit. That's what St. Paul says, right? Different people have different gifts, different spirits. Okay. So that's the third sign, right? The inability to maintain, to meditate, and the reflections. But then God begins to work in the Spirit. So we move to the next phase of this dark night. And your notes kind of begin over here, I think, the notes for today. And again, follow them later at home. Right now, just hear what I'm saying. And if you find it difficult, and if you want to go through this video again with your notes, that might be the best way to. Okay, so how are people to conduct themselves if they find themselves in the dark night? Those who have entered the dark night. And some of the things that he says are actually counterintuitive. And you'll ask me, really? That's what he's saying? But let's wait for that. So during the purgations of the dark night, spiritual persons have to endure great afflictions. Not so much because of the dryness or the aridity, but because they're afraid that they will be lost on this road. So, and it's really true, right? I have been doing the purification, right? God has been leading me. I've done everything that I've done. And now, instead of God being more accessible, I'm experiencing the opposite. What is God doing? God is like the mother who is weaning you from those sensory sweetness, right? And at that point, remember what we are doing. We are actually leaving ourselves in God's hands, remember? Like we are not in control. And at that point, there is a sense of fear. It's not like there is a book that I'm following directions. This is what's happening in the Spirit. And when you're in the state of the dark night, you're afraid that you might get lost. They think that they're spiritually ruined and that God has forsaken them because they find no satisfaction in holy things. Before you did, now I don't. And they might weary themselves and strive to fix the powers of the soul. I'm not feeling this, what should I do? Oh, let me go for spiritual direction to this person. Oh, this person didn't help, let me go to this person, right? Or you begin to read some other book that you are going to. Why? Because I'm going back to my old habit of the sensory sweetness. So they might weary themselves, strive to fix the powers of the soul because they're afraid not to do anything at all. What am I doing? I'm not feeling God. I can't meditate. What am I doing? It's hard to not do anything. However, the soul might dislike this because what does the soul want? Solitude and quiet. So there is a way that we can do too many religious things and create disquiet for the soul. They're not saying don't go for Mass. That's not the point, right? But if I don't feel when I have received the Eucharist, if I'm not jumping for joy, don't try to fix it. What is the reality? God is as present whether you are feeling the sweetness or not. So the soul might dislike all these things that you do to fix the powers of the soul, because what the soul really wants is peace and quiet, and not the faculties being at work, busy. So those who find themselves in this condition, John of the Cross says, take courage and persevere in patience. And Mother Teresa, 60 years. Let them have the confidence that God never forsakes those who seek God. This is the most difficult part of it. Folks, we are people who are constantly, and rightly so. I mean, when I'm driving, you better be in control of the vehicle, right? And so life is like a car that we drive, and we have to be in control at all the time. But when it comes to this, you just have to give up the control. Isn't there a famous song called Jesus Take the Wheel? What does that mean? That I'm no more in control. And we always say, dear God, take control, but we will never give up the wheel. When I was back in the seminary, there was an example of somebody who, gave the story about, okay, so you're driving along the way, on the highway, you're alone, and there's somebody who's hitchhiking, and you stop. Well, your bad luck, it happens to be Jesus. And you ask Jesus, where do you want to go? And Jesus says, no, it's not where I want to go. That's none of your... Give me the keys. Get out of the car. I'm in the driver's seat, and you become the passenger. Where are we going? Come and see. That's what Jesus said to the disciples, right? Contemplation is getting to that point of not being in control. And we are people, I mean, this is counterintuitive, right? Because all our lives, what we do is to be in control. And now when it comes here, no wonder this is the dark night. Because we are not in control. All we have to have is be courageous, persevere in patience, and know, this is trust. This is trust. And know that God never forsakes those who seek. And the greatest example, we are in Holy Week, the greatest example of that is, once again, Jesus on the cross. My God, why have you abandoned me? Do you know, after that, the words are Jesus saying, I, what? Thirst. You might call it contemplation or the dark night, right? Waiting for the... Ultimately, what does Jesus say? He says at the end, Father, into your hands. He's feeling abandoned. He's thirsty. But at the end, he says, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. Now that is trust. He doesn't feel it. He's dying. He dies. But even in that last moment of death where he says, is it going to happen now? Is it going to happen now? It doesn't. He's put in the tomb. That is still trust. That is trust. Confidence that God will not abandon. That's the level of trust that we will be driven to for us to be in contemplation. So the conduct to be observed in the night of the senses is, and this is where I said one of the things that is very counterintuitive. In no degree have recourse to meditation, because what you're doing is you're disturbing the soul with the faculty of the mind. In no degree have recourse in meditation, but let the soul be quiet and rest. They may think they're doing nothing, that they're losing time, and that it might be their lukewarmness to blame. However, they will do enough if they keep patience and persevere in prayer. All they have to do is to keep their soul free and rest from all the thoughts, all the knowledge. Not anxious about their meditation, but rather directing their attention lovingly and calmly towards God. All this without anxiety or effort or the desire. So I would say that he's even saying, don't even desire at that point, when is this going to happen? You leave that totally into the hands of God. All this without anxiety or effort or the desire to feel and taste God's presence. For such effort, disquiet the soul and distract it from the calm response and sweet tranquility of contemplation. If they were to exert their inferior faculties, they would simply hinder and ruin the good which God is working in the soul. So he gives the example of a person who's sitting quietly for a portrait. So, when a portrait is drawn, the subject has to sit quietly. So say the painter is drawing the portrait, and the person then moves, all the work that the painter has done gets lost, because now it's a different posture. Same thing with the soul that's waiting for God to do its work. You got to rest. When the soul interiorly rests, every action and passion will disturb it and make it feel the dryness and emptiness of the sense. The more it strives to find help in affections and knowledge, that more it will feel deficiency, which at this point cannot be supplied in that way. So here's the deal. Understand this. The soul is waiting for God to act. What you do is, if you act, that's not what the soul wants. Do you understand this? The soul's appetite at this point has gotten to the point where only God can fulfill it. You are letting the soul to rest so God can fulfill the appetite. But if you keep prodding and poking, the soul says, but that's not what I want. I don't want your meditation. I don't want what you're thinking. I don't want your knowledge. I'm looking for something else. This feels very deficient to the soul. What the soul needs is for its appetite to be filled in the Spirit. That deficiency of the soul, it can only be filled by God. So it is expedient for the soul in this condition not to be troubled because its faculties have become useless, rather by not hindering the operation of infused contemplation. Infused contemplation, I'm using this for the very first time. Infused means it is coming from, it is being brought into us by God. It's infused, not self-created. It's infused. Now, this infused contemplation is a stage to which God is now admitting the soul. And the soul feels refreshed in peaceful abundance and set on fire with the spirit of love, which this contemplation, dim and secret, induces and establishes within it. So this is still not the state of perfection. So we are going from the state of beginners to the proficients. From the proficients, when you do the next book of the Dark Night, then it's when you're moving from being proficient to perfection. So those are the steps. Beginners, we did this in the beginning of this. There are the three stages. There are the beginners, the proficients, and those who are in perfection. We are not even in that perfection stage. We're just moving from the beginners to the proficients. So this is where God slowly takes us from the beginner stage through the dark night into the stage of the proficients, this infused contemplation, which is still dim and secret, quiet, because the next stage is what's going to take it to the stage of perfection. So John of the Cross does not lay down a general rule for the cessation of meditation. So he's not saying that there is no rule. When do I stop meditation? What kind of meditation? He doesn't say all that. According to him, that should just occur when meditation is no longer feasible. At other times, one can take recourse in meditation on the life and the passion of Christ, which is the best means of purification and of patience and security on the road, and an admirable aid to the highest contemplation. So what he's saying, if you're trying to do meditation, when you don't feel like, if you're still trying to do, the one thing that you could do is to focus on the life and passion of Christ, which is the best means of purification according to him. And with patience and with confidence. I love this. I don't think I've put this in, maybe I have put this in your notes, but contemplation is nothing. This is John of the Cross, direct quote. Contemplation is nothing else but a secret, peaceful, and loving infusion of God, which, if admitted, will set the soul on fire with the spirit of love. That may be in your notes for this time. Is it there? Mm-hmm. In fact, take that to prayer this week. Contemplation is nothing but a secret, peaceful, and loving infusion of God, which, if admitted, will set the soul on fire with the spirit of love. And it is in this sense of being inflamed with the spirit of love that he writes the poem, Loving Flame of Love. So now you understand the title of that poem that he wrote, which we did 3 years back. By the way, that was just the first line of that first stanza, on one dark night. So I've spent two hours just trying to talk about one dark night. Just explain what dark night means, right? Okay. So the second line of the first stanza, fired with love's urgent longings. So by the way, the first stanza is, one dark night, fired with love's urgent longings. Ah, sheer grace. I went out unseen, my house being now all stilled. By the way, the second stanza, in darkness and secure by the secret ladder, disguised, ah, sheer grace, in darkness and concealment, my house being now all stilled. That is the subject of book 2 of The Dark Night, which is the spiritual part of the soul. Maybe next Lent, maybe. Okay, so fired with love's urgent longings. So the burning of love that John is talking about is not felt at first, John says. It's not felt at first. This is because of the natural impurity, or because the soul has not given itself to peaceful rest. Sometimes, however, a certain longing after God begins to be felt. And the more it grows, the more the soul feels itself touched and inflamed with the love of God, without knowing or understanding how or where that love came from. This is contemplation. This is that the soul is now being fulfilled in what the soul truly desires, this union with God. And suddenly the soul has the sense of, and the only way it can be described, John of the Cross says, is poems. You can't put it in words. There's no way to describe it. He says that sometimes you don't know where that came from, except that at times this burning so inflames that it longs earnestly after God. he even says, and of course, none of us have had this experience. He's talking from his own experience. The longings of the soul for God are so deep that the very bones seem to dry up in that thirst. So think about Jesus crying, "I thirst." So it's not only that his physical thirst, this is his thirst now for God. So the very bones seem to dry up, and the body's health withers, the natural warmth and energies, they almost perish in the intensity of that thirst for love. The soul feels it to be a living thirst. This is quote John of the Cross. The soul feels it to be a living thirst, and we may say of this thirst that being a living thirst, it kills. As he says, this love is not felt at first, only dryness and emptiness, general painful anxiety about God, and a painful consciousness that it's not serving God. But a soul anxious and afflicted in a sacrifice, but a soul anxious and afflicted is a sacrifice pleasing to God. We come to the third line. Again, I have not dealt with it with the extensiveness that you can because of the constriction of time. But the third line is, sheer grace. The sheer grace. When the divine love is evoked in the person, the soul makes great gains. It may not think that it does, but the gain that is made is, let me put it this way. You remember, before you entered the dark night, you had all that sweetness, and the darkness felt like a big burden. Why? Why am I entering into this time? But now that it is beyond it, and the soul experiences this infused contemplation, now it looks upon what it has escaped and suddenly calls the night the happy night. Why? Because it is because of the happy night you moved from this part of the sensory part of the soul and what it was giving you to the spiritual. So if you hadn't gone through the dark night, and that's what it calls, sheer grace. I have said this before. For John of the Cross, the dark night is really not dark night. It is one step towards divine union, towards contemplation. And so, as it looks back at where it has come from and how content it was in the inferior levels of spiritual satisfaction, there is a higher level of spiritual contemplation that is, but we were happy here. And then God takes you from that to the dark night and reveals a love that is far superior to what you ever experienced. And now the soul is able to look back and say, sheer grace, because that dark night becomes the way in which to enter into contemplation. Sheer grace. I went out unseen. That is the fourth line of that stanza. I went out unseen. Now, in some way, he's returning back to the earlier states. So just pardon that a little bit. So this going forth, I went out unseen, is to be understood as that state of the senses when the soul labored, seeking God in weak and narrow and sometimes he would say useless ways, because he knows what's really awaiting. So I went out unseen is referring to the times when the soul labored in seeking God in weak ways, in narrow ways. It then fell at every step into 1,000 imperfections and ignorances. Remember the capital sins that John spoke about. Spiritual greed, spiritual pride, spiritual luxury, all that, the spiritual envy, all that. You were trying to work yourself in weaker ways, and you kept falling into these pits. The dark night delivers the soul from this state, the previous state. And that's the meaning of I went out unseen. It will be great comfort and joy to those who travel on this road to observe that which seemed so rugged and harsh, so contrary to spiritual sweetness, works in him so great a good. In other words, the dark night, it seems like it's a rough patch. And it seems so contrary, counterintuitive to what should be happening, which is, I'm making all my efforts to love God more, and I'm feeling nothing. It seems contrary to what it should be. But finally, when you finish that stage and you come to the higher level, you see how that ruggedness, that harshness, has brought about such good for the soul. And the good flows to all aspects of the soul in this night, brings great happiness and great good. This is so because the desires are extinguished. You know, to a certain extent, the great mystics, when you bring all the mystics together, whatever religion you're from, when you bring the mystics together, they're all saying the same thing. So those of you who are familiar with Buddhism, Buddha, his greatest effort was to find a way out of suffering. Because he was a prince, and one time he went into the park and he saw this crippled man, or then an aged man, and then a person being taken to, and it really captures his imagination. He says, why is the human condition this way? And then he comes out with the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. He comes up with that path. And he sits on a meditation. He goes and sits under the tree, and he sits there. He says, still I have gotten the answer to this. I'm not going to. And he sits first, and then he has that enlightenment, what we call the enlightenment of. And you know what the answer was to this question of suffering? The main reason for suffering is desire. Desire. So he comes up with the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path to help humanity find a way out of suffering, which is. And so, if you look at the ascent to Mount Carmel, which is so Buddha is way before Christ, and this is in the 16th century. How many centuries? And I have no idea that John of the Cross ever read Buddha, right? But the point is that what he's saying is the ascent to Mount Carmel is all about not having any desire, only preparing the soul, purifying the soul, both in the sensory part of the soul and the spiritual part of the soul, for God to do God's thing. So the reason why at this point John talks about I went out unseen is because the older ways of finding the spiritual sweetness is now extinguished. Desires are extinguished. And the person who is now ready to move on into the dark night is the one who, as Jesus would say, is prepared to walk through the narrow gate. The narrow gate is the night of the sense. The soul detached itself from sense detaches itself from the sense that it may enter, basing on faith, that which is a stranger to all senses. So the spiritual part that he's talking about, he's saying, I went out unseen. Why? Because this is an area that I am unfamiliar with. So you free yourself of these desires, especially to experience the sweetness of the sensory part of the soul. And you're free from that, and you give yourself to that which is strange and not typically experienced in our human situation. And that is based on our faith in a God who infuses contemplation in us. Advancing towards God in most pure faith is the means of union with Him. Advancing towards God in most pure faith, in the purest way, where it is free from all desires, having purified ourselves, is the means of union with God. People say to me that when they leave this hour, the head is splitting, so mine is too. Next week, the last week, we are going to talk about, and maybe the notes are already there with you, I'll find out, the benefits which the night or the sense brings to the soul. So once the dark night, what are the benefits to the soul? Besides the fact of infused contemplation, what are the benefits to the soul? We will discuss this next time, and then I'll end with a certain, tying this all up with a few points. And that'll be the 6 weeks of the dark night. Folks, good night and God bless.